friends. I'm Dr. Arun Sikarwar. Today, we are going to have a very interesting webinar entitled Civil Service Training, Ethical Standards, and the Workers' Moral Duties to Truth and Integrity to help build a planetary culture of peace. So, we shall be having discussion over the trainings of civil servants in the UK, in Europe, as well as in the United Nations, and how and when they receive training in ethics and the role of whistleblowers, and what to do when difficult policy changes are being imposed by narrow-minded politicians in some countries. We shall be also having discussion over comparative civil services over India, China, and American civil services system. So before we start our formal webinar, I would like to have brief introduction of both the panelists. So we have Professor Thomas Daffern, joining from Paris. Professor Daffern is having more than 5 decades of teaching experience over comparative religious studies, theology, peace studies, global ethics, history of science, and comparative philosophy to adults, children, and university students. Professor Thomas Daffern has been working at the University of London and University of Oxford, teaching religious studies and philosophy. He's an effective educator and scholar who has traveled all through the world countries and having international perspective of academic work here and there in the world. He has co-chaired 30 meetings in the House of Lords on ethics and policy, and he has spoken twice in the United Nations headquarters in New York on peace studies and academic developments. He has also been a faculty member and associated with the capacity of mentoring civil services students in the United Kingdom and other European countries. Indeed, Professor Thomas Daffern's biodata is quite long, having wide exposure of academic and professional activities. So I would like to welcome Professor Thomas joining with us. On the other hand, our co-panelist is Sri K. Siddhartha. He's a strategic thinker, geostrategist, knowledge and perception management consultant, thought leadership trainer, and advisor to several international and state governments. He's a distinguished earth scientist, educationist, policymaker, and a prolific author of more than 110 research papers in peer-reviewed journals. He has been a mentor, and so far the list goes more than 1,500 students who has qualified for IAS, IFS, IPS, IRS, and other civil services in India. He has over 20 years experience in mentoring for earth science, life sciences, and personality development in top management and educational institutes in India and abroad. He is a prolific author and has written 43 books on cosmology, geology, meteorology, oceanography, environmental sciences, human geography, and international relations. He is an academician, and he is pursuing right now a research in paleogeographic reconstruction of the whole world through his very promising project, Vashundhara, the Mini Planet. He's again a very prolific and eminent speaker. And with these brief bio of both the speakers, now I would like to request Professor Thomas Daffern to give his keynote lecture. Professor Daffern.
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me. And I'm glad that we can be here through Zoom discussing these very important issues. Thank you for your generous introductory words. So I want to just say a little bit more. First point, I've got 14 points I want to make. I'm writing a book about mathematics and philosophy at the moment, so I'm thinking mathematically. So I've got 14 points. The first one, I just want to say a little bit more about my background so your viewers will understand where I'm coming from. I mean, I'm primarily an academic, a philosopher, and but I do believe that intellectuals have a moral and social duty. So I've been very active in education in the political arena. I've taught political science. I've studied as part of my degree the history of political ideas going right back to Plato and the ancient world. And I ran my 33 seminars in the House of Lords because I feel Parliament is important in every country, like in India or Britain. And I think educators have a duty to go on trying to educate politicians, because, you know, politicians, like everyone else, are subject to life's difficulties and challenges. So I ran a series of seminars on ethics and policy. I think politicians need to update their ethical knowledge because they're dealing with complex world issues. Look at COVID, it's suddenly come out of nowhere. And the trouble is politicians are not, because they're busy, they don't have a chance to study ethics. And I think that some kind of ethical training should be compulsory for all politicians. I've actually come up with a theory, a proposal, that politicians should need a license to practice their craft. Just like a doctor, a medical doctor, or a veterinarian, or any professional, a teacher needs a license. You have to qualify, do your degrees, get a license. And then you're subject to review by professional colleagues. And if you commit what's called malpractice as a doctor, you're struck off the register, you can no longer practice. I think that politicians should have a licensing system. And if they commit malpractice, i.e. corruption or mendacity, i.e. deliberate lying for personal gain, they should be struck off the register of politicians. And I think the same is true for civil servants. So these ideas have taken shape during the years I worked for the House of Lords. I was not myself elected to the House of Lords or appointed, although I was nominated. I'm not a member of the House of Lords. But I worked with members of the House of Lords to discuss ethics and policy at a difficult time in the UK's history in the 1990s and the 2000s. I obviously, as a peace expert, I felt and feel that the UK should be doing much more for peace. We're a small country, but we have a lot of influence. We're on the UN Security Council. We have this Commonwealth, which includes India and Canada and Australia. We should be using all this to make a more peaceful world. Instead, I watched as the UK governments have been hijacked by military, industrial, types who seem to want to turn the UK into a sort of weapons manufacturing, technology-based, unethical system. Now, this and the latest project is Brexit, to take them out of the European Union so they don't have to comply with European Union ethical standards on things like weapons sales to regimes that have no human rights, and also to financial. The other reason the Brexit people wanted out is because they're extreme cutthroat capitalists that want to go on playing their money markets without any kind of moral constraints, which the European Union was putting. So anyway, so that's where I'm coming from. I also used to attend meetings at the Foreign Office in Westminster as an NGO leader, as an academic, discussing human rights in Europe, and through the OSCE, it's the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And I was active in East-West peacemaking during the 90s, ending the Cold War. So that's my background in terms of my interest in policy and politics. I want to start talking, my second point is about the UK civil service. So what's the story here? Well, we used to pride ourselves on having a good civil service. The theory, it was created gradually during the Victorian era, and it had a tradition of impartiality. The civil servant was a servant of society, of civilized values. They had to work with integrity, transparency and veracity. And the theory is they just implement what the minister says. So if the Minister of Transport says, we want to do policy X and build a whole new fleet of buses running on, I don't know, hydrogen fuel, then you, the civil servant, work out how best to do that, the cheapest and best way to do it. And that system works, and it has worked on the whole. The civil servant has a right to advise the minister and say, look, I think it's a bad idea. I mean, if the minister comes up with the project, we're going to convert all the buses in London to run on nuclear technology, and each one is going to have a little nuclear reactor in the bus, and it's great. Well, you have the right to advise them, actually, this is very dangerous. London will probably be destroyed if you have little nuclear buses running around. So you have a duty to say, no, this is a bad idea. The minister can override you, but you can, at the last resort, you can refuse to implement the policy by resigning. You can say, no, I feel this is such a terrible idea. Nuclear buses is so bad. I can't live with this on my conscience, so I'm going to resign unless you change your policy. So that's how the system worked. And up until recently, it's kind of worked quite well. But we're now under threat in the United Kingdom. We have a whole new bunch of politicians who've seized power, who've implemented this Brexit concept, which is against the well-being, the long-term strategic interests, the security interests of my country. Every single academic who's researched this has said this is a catastrophe. And yet, what they've done is through the manipulation of social media, in a psychological warfare operation, they've managed to seize control of our democracy and force this through. So now we have a chap who's not elected, he's called Dominic Cummings, who is now implementing this policy as if he's some kind of secret agent for a foreign power. He spent 5 years in Russia, and you can work out where his loyalties probably lie. He's pursuing a policy against the wishes of my country, which is simply and solely in the interests of Russia. So now civil servants have been resigning, they've been leaking stuff to the press. They're in chaos because what do you do? And what this man Dominic Cummings has been doing is basically sacking them all. He's been bringing them into his office and telling them to go. So we are living through what is essentially a crisis in the civil service integrity in my country, which has never happened before in my lifetime. This is the worst ever event, and we still don't know how it's going to pan out. We're watching this like every day develop. I believe there should be a right to whistleblow if, for instance, what the government has done is silenced reports. All professional reports by academics saying Brexit is a bad policy have been silenced. They refuse to publish them. There was a report by Parliament's Intelligence Committee, which has the oversight of Britain's intelligence services, MI6, MI5, which was warning that Britain had been penetrated by Russian intelligence who'd organized Brexit. And the government refused to publish it. They sat on it, right, during the last general election, which meant that they won the election. So, this is beyond scandalous. It's in an area of constitutional manipulation that is, scandalous. Anyway, the report's finally been published, and genuine politicians are now standing up against this coup, effectively. Now, what does the civil servant do? Well, they try to stick by the rules. But what do you do when a government comes into power that's changing all the rules and that's threatening your life, your job, your mortgage, everything? So we're living through a really difficult time in the UK. But I believe in the robustness of our constitution. One of the problems is it's not written down. The reason they've got away with this is because we don't have a written constitution. In India, you do, you're fortunate. And so if anyone tried this nonsense in India, they'd be stopped by the constitution. It'd go to court. And I believe, I haven't read the whole thing, But I believe there's enough robustness in the Indian constitution to prevent a sort of coup like this. If a cabal got into power in India who were pursuing policies in the interests of China, let's say they were going to split India up into 4 regional countries, and that was their policy, I think people in the Indian, law profession and politics would be able to prevent it. But I don't know. Let's see. Let's watch. I hope it never happens. But it's happening in my country, and because we have no written constitution, they're getting away with it. So one of the lessons of this is we need a written constitution in every country so that people can't act in this unethical way. We also need written guidelines for civil servants in the UK and other countries as to what to do in this sort of emergency. It's a bit like an airplane when the pilot goes mad and is intent on crashing the plane. Does the crew have the legal right to break into the cockpit and disable the pilot and take over? Well, obviously, yes, to safeguard the lives of the passengers. But we need that in writing. I mean, if you think back to Hitler's Germany, the civil servants just went along with Nazism. Some of them protested, some of them said, no, this is wrong. But enough of them carried on with it so that that's how Hitler got away with his madness. Right. So we need written guidelines. At a certain point, whistleblowing has to kick in, and the civil servant should be protected legally for saying, I'm going into the cockpit to disable this captain. He's gone mad, Right, so I want to move on now. The third point I want to mention is the French civil service, which is also interesting. I live in France now, and contrasting it with the UK experience. The French civil service really starts from the French Revolution in 1789. The French people decided to get rid of the old aristocratic system and to have a government for the people, elected by the people, representing everybody, whatever your wealth or status. And it introduced this concept of the rights of man and woman. And that was a major achievement. When Napoleon took power, he kept that revolutionary ideal. And he very much modified the French civil service so that the ideal of serving the state, l'État in French, it's a great honor to be a civil servant in France. It has a lot of kudos. He invented the Légion d'honneur, which is what you get if you do very good works. And he also refounded French academia. He founded the current French Grande École, the great polytechnics and think tanks and so on. And he also introduced the Code Napoleon, which is the law. Everybody in France is under the law. Whether you're the president or a street sweeper, you have the same rights and duties. We also have a written constitution, and that means that our rights are safeguarded. This is all very important. When I see what's going on in the UK, it couldn't happen here in France, thank God. They're too intelligent. The French also, have a respect for intellectuals, and there's been a lot of service by intelligent people in the French civil service. And they genuinely try and work out what's best for the country, Okay, I want to talk now about the European Union, because that's a new experiment among all 27 European countries. We've come together to try and end war, because European nations used to go to war with each other regularly. World War I, World War II, but we've been fighting since the 100 Years' War, 500 years of European history of warfare. And after World War II, the European nations said enough, no more, never again. World War III would destroy the world. World War II almost did. So we created the European Union as a voluntary confederal arrangement whereby each country succeeds a little bit of sovereignty, but it retains its nationhood, its identity, its culture, its language, all that. It just gives enough power to the central European Union to be able to regulate things, especially economic matters, trade, education to some extent. And it's been working fine. some great intellectuals have worked for the European Union. It was founded by Monet, who was a very clever French academic and a friend of Roosevelt, the president. And others, you know, have been very active in supporting it. So the British, the catastrophic English withdrawal is, you know, is in the realm of the absurd, and the people that are behind it are just bonkers, in my opinion. But the European Union, the question before us is, do they have an oath of loyalty to the European Union? The answer is yes. Civil servants that work for the European Union in Brussels or Strasbourg, you know, their duty is to the European continent as a whole. And it would be interesting to study how they are trained. They have their own mechanisms of advancement and so on. One question that is an issue is sometimes people think they're too well paid. There are many civil servants in the European Union that are paid huge amounts of money, right? When I was living in Scotland, I proposed the following, and I think this is a good idea, that no civil servant in the European Union should receive a salary bigger than the lowest paid prime minister. So the 27 nations, you know, the poorest nation, I don't know, Romania, say. So the salary of that prime minister, I don't know what it would be, you know, let's say it's a sum, £100,000 a year, I don't know. Well, I don't think any civil servant working for the European Union should earn more than that. It's a symbolic thing. But they do, you know, and I think that's wrong. I think too much power has gone. And that's one of the reasons why the Brexit lobby were able to persuade the British voters the European Union is too powerful. I think that, I don't agree with that argument, but I do think the European Union civil servants have a duty to, like, tone down their power, you know, in a intelligent way. So, okay, now I want to talk about the Indian civil service, which I have a lot of respect for. I've traveled to your amazing country at least 10 times. I love India. And I love the whole thing about India's experiment in, it is the largest democracy on the planet. And your civil service was inherited partly from the British, obviously. And I think the traditions of neutrality, impartiality, and integrity that exist within it are descended from the British civil service at its best. When the British were in India, in the, let's say, before independence, most of the civil servants that worked did their best, I think. They were a bunch of interesting people, the Anglo-Indians, who tried to get the railways running, you know, the streets sort of organized and transport, and they did their best for India, and they loved the country, right? When they had to leave and handed over power to Nehru and you know, the rest of the Congress party and so on, and also in Pakistan, I mean, I think personally it was a tragedy that India couldn't stay together as one country and that you couldn't work out a deal. But that's just sadly the, you know, ineptitude of politics. But having got independence, then I think the civil service has carried on with those traditions. I think there have been challenges, you know, in the history of modern India. I think the current government is putting new challenges in the path of impartiality, and it's raising, I think, dangerously this sort of religious divisiveness. Identifying Indianness with Hinduism, ignoring the fact that there's vast numbers of Muslims, vast numbers of Jains, and quite a lot of Christians and Buddhists. And, you know, India is a multicultural experiment, an interfaith experiment. And when I went to Nehru's museum in Delhi, where he lived for many years, you know, on his table, there are many statues of religions, Buddha figures, you know, all that stuff. And obviously, the Indian independence movement was influenced a lot by theosophy, which was Annie Besant and so on. They wanted a harmony of all religions. I don't want India to lose that. So I'd be interested. You can tell me when I finish more, hopefully, about what kind of oaths of impartiality are required by Indian civil servants now, and are they you know, do they have a legal right to whistleblow? If they think a policy by a given prime minister is dangerous, might lead to conflict, I would say that they should have a duty to speak out and try and prevent it. You know, the civil service has a duty to try and put forward the wisest options. So when the prime minister says, okay, we need a policy on the Babri Masjid, we need to know what to do, you put forward 3 policies, and you're in charge of religious policy for India. You put 3 policies forward, all of which are wise. You don't put forward the really stupid one, you know, because politicians tend to go for the stupid ideas. So your duty as a civil servant is to give them the option, any one of which is a wisdom choice. And for that, you have to be sneaky. Okay, now I want to talk briefly about America and their system in North America, as I'm most familiar with. I think we have problems with the USA, which we're seeing with this current president. And I have questions. You know, the Americans don't seem to have an ethic of integrity in their political system. We're seeing this, how a president can come into power who doesn't believe in veracity or integrity, who's a businessman who's made his life from lying and bullying, and he tries to bring this policy into the American government. And it's been really interesting watching. You know, we saw the attempted impeachment, but because of the polarization of American politics, the Republicans all voted against it. So we're watching a similar crisis as in Britain, as politics becomes very, very divisive and in the hands of people that make mendacity a cult. And I believe that the system, I mean, they at least have a written constitution. You know, he will eventually fall. The people will be electing a new president in November, I believe, from the other party. And I think the American civil service will sigh with relief. But, you know, it raises lots of questions. And I think that the president should have to swear an oath, and all of Congress, as I've said before, the duty of veracity. So they shouldn't be allowed to lie on matters of policy or anything, either as your president or prime minister or a member of Congress or Senate. And I think this one law would transform the system for the better. And American civil servants likewise. Just to say that in Canada, where I'm partly Canadian, you see, and I've lived in Canada, I think we have a better civil service tradition in Canada. It's why we don't get people like that Trump chap in office. And there's a much more a sense of loyalty to the country as a whole, and a more polite kind of politics, if you want. And the current Prime Minister Trudeau is, I think, an exemplar of that. There's still a functioning liberal democratic concept of duty to the nation as a whole, and every single individual, regardless of your race, your color, your religion. So the racism card that Trump's been playing would not be possible in Canada. You can't do that. And, you know, partly because it's a federal system and it's French and English and it's a mélange. Okay, I want to mention briefly the Russian civil service, because Russia's also a great power. And obviously at the time of the revolution, and with the increase of power of Leninists and then Stalinists, the Russian civil service ceased to function in an ethical manner. If you read a biography of Stalin, for instance, I mean, he was picking henchmen who would serve him personally, and he was appointing them to go and massacre his enemies, and literally millions were killed off. I mean, it's shocking. I'm reading a biography by a great British historian, Simon Seedbag Montefiore, about Stalin's rule. And so in his mind, the civil service was there to do what the dictator wanted. They had no right to question. If you questioned him, you were shot. It's as simple as that. You were arrested, often tortured, and then you were shot. You know, that's breaking the ethical compact between a ruler and the people completely. And eventually the Russians grew out of, you know, Khrushchev came into power, he denounced Stalin's tactics, although he himself had benefited from them and taken part in them in the 1950s and 40s and 30s. He had blood on his hands too. But gradually, the Russian improved till you get to Gorbachev. Now, Gorbachev, I went to Moscow in 1990 when Gorbachev was in power, and there was a tremendous feeling of hope. Gorbachev was like a knight coming to the rescue of Russia's soul. And I think he did. He introduced perestroika, the idea of openness, of transparency, and he denounced the old Stalinist tactics. The trouble is that he fell from power too soon. There was a coup, as you know, and Yeltsin came into power, who played the Russian nationalist card. And this led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And again, people's loyalties were stretched. An independent Ukraine came into government, into power, which then split people's loyalties. Are they true to the whole, project of Russia, or just to a new country called Ukraine, or what? This creates all kinds of psychological, and now there's a civil war going on. Could this have been avoided? Yes, I think it could have done. Should Russian civil servants have tried harder? Yes, they should. What could they have done? Well, as I say, they should have found the wisdom path. They should have put on Yeltsin's desk or Gorbachev's desk the option that would keep the country together in peace and yet satisfy the nationalist ambitions of, Ukraine, Armenia, and all the rest of it. But we are where we are. So if I was advising Putin on his civil service, what would I say? I'd say you have to give them ethical training. They have to have the right to whistleblow if people are doing wrong things. They have to have trust for the Russian people. And, you need to build a democratic system. So that would be my advice. Is Putin doing that? Well, it's too early to say. There are some dangerous signs that he likes power too much and is going down the old Stalinist route. That's always the problem. It's a challenge to Russians. Russians think that dictatorship is actually, God's law. Well, I think Lavrov is a very clever foreign minister. I think he has a more democratic instinct. And I believe that my Russian colleagues will weather this time. And the role of the Russian civil service is interesting. I've known people in the diplomatic community in Russia, and they're highly intelligent people. Their training is superb. But I would love to know more about their ethical training. I'm personally friends with people at the Institute of Philosophy in Moscow, which is the think tank of philosophy. They ought to be training more ethics into Russian diplomats and civil servants and so on. So there's some work to be done. Another important question is, what about intelligence services? There's a lot of, panic in my country of UK that Russian intelligence have done terrible deeds. Not least organized Brexit. So where do intelligence agents come in as civil servants? Are they liable to follow ethical laws, or do they have the right to do anything they want against another country? And this is a big issue. If I'm a Chinese Secret Service agent and I come to India, can I do anything I want? Am I answerable to nobody? Can I just go and plant a bomb in Parliament or whatever? No, I think not. There should be ethical rules governing intelligence agents as well. Otherwise, they're not very intelligent, because ethics includes ethical intelligence. And I've written to Lavrov, I've written to Russian leaders, calling for a cyber peace treaty. Russia and Britain and other countries should sign a treaty. We will not commit cyber warfare against your country. We will not spread lies about India, that they're all whatever, terrible people. And likewise, India won't spread lies about us. And if every country in the world signed a cyber peace treaty and everyone stuck to it, it would diffuse a lot the kind of, the sort of constant fear that people are living in at the moment. So, and I am pleased to say that Lavrov announced at the last UN General Assembly opening speeches, he said he was raising this matter at the UN Security Council. So I don't know what's happened to it, Now, I want to talk briefly about Chinese civil service. And again, we have the same problem. In the old days, China's civilization had a very, very important role for civil servants. It had 5 ministries ordained by heaven, founded by the first emperor, Huang Ti. They had a Taoist belief in ethics, and Confucius amplified this. It was the duty of the minister to be ethical at all times, because, you know, the sage unites heaven and earth through righteousness. And Chinese philosophy is all about righteousness. When Mao came to power, he threw all this in the river, and he terrorized people at the barrel of a gun, just like Stalin did. And it was because of Stalin Mao got into power. He was helping him. So we've had decades of terrible, terrible suffering for the Chinese people under a ruthless regime. Now, we're told it's softened. The old days of Mao Zedong have gone, but have they? You know, I'm just asking the question. It seems to me the Chinese Communist Party still has pretty much absolute control in that country. And you can't be a civil servant and go against Communist Party rules. You have to just do what the party says. And the current leader has reinforced centralization in China and is now trying to apply that in Hong Kong against the democratic will of those people. And obviously, you know, Tibet is another tragic story, how they have been the victims of this communist sort of centralization of power. So I don't know, where do the Chinese civil servants get trained? I asked the question. Probably in Communist Party academies. And if you look at what the Uyghurs are suffering, the Muslims of central China, they're putting them all in concentration camps just for believing in the Quran and in Allah and the last day and so on. That's not the way to deal with religious minorities, you know. I mean, in my opinion. As a philosopher, I've worked on the relationship between 19th century materialism, Marxism, say, and science and religious thought, so Christian, Islamic, Hindu ideas. They are reconcilable. We should be having discussions, dialectical exchanges between scientists and Muslims and Marxists and everyone. You know, we don't need to put each other in concentration camps. This is a primitive thing. And I was shocked when Trump apparently said to the president of China, "Jolly good what you're doing with the Muslims," you know. It's shocking and shows his lack of intellect and ethics. So then briefly, I don't have time to say about the Middle East, but I would love to know more about civil servants in Lebanon. This tragedy that's happened in Beirut is a catastrophe. There is going to be an inquiry. Let's hope they find the truth of what was behind it. I know Israel quite well. I've been many times, and I know how the Knesset works. There is a civil service in Israel that functions. But again, Netanyahu and his extremist policies are pushing that to the test. You know, at what point do you say to Netanyahu, actually, that policy is wrong and evil, and I won't do it? And do you get to keep your job? You know, I think they are beginning to say that, and the legal profession in Israel is robust, stemming from the British time when we ran the country. There is an independent legal system, and I think Netanyahu will be going to prison eventually. It's just like we're waiting. In Egypt too, and other Middle East countries, Iran. Again, here it's more complicated because in an Islamic country like Iran, there's a feeling of, you know, to be a good Iranian, you have to be a good Shiite Muslim. And where's your loyalty? Is it to God? Is it to the constitution? Is it to the leader? Is it to the people? There is a tradition in Islam of service to the community as a way of fulfilling God's command. I'm doing a commentary on the Quran. I've been spending 6 years as a philosopher of religion. If you read it correctly, it's an amazing manual for being an excellent civil servant and a great person. But the trouble is that it's not always read correctly, and therefore increasing the education in Middle Eastern universities and so on about ethics is very important. I've called for peace studies departments in every university in the Middle East. There are a few in Israel. There's a peace museum in Tehran. But I would like more peace studies institutes in Middle Eastern countries, including Pakistan. You know, they should be reading the Quran as a peace text, not as a let's go and kill people in Kashmir text. Okay, so just to sum up, I'm coming to the end now. We need an oath of veracity, as I've said, in all parliaments worldwide, and among civil servants, so that if we start speaking the truth to each other, and we have to by law, it would transform the way politics is, you know, and it would transform the way we serve each other in our professional capacity. The next point is we need a sense of planetary responsibility. So I should be loyal not just to my country, Britain or Canada. I should be loyal to the whole world, and I am. You know, I'm a global thinker. I run an institute devoted to global philosophy. But if I'm a civil servant, and I regard academics as servants of the community, in some countries academics are civil servants. So we have a duty to the whole planet. As Kant said, I should do in my actions what advances humanity, not just Germany or England or India or China. We need to grow out of that nationalist era, and we need to realize that all of us are planetary citizens. And that should be something that is implicit in the written constitution of each country and in our civil services, respectively, that we should try and find the best solutions to our national problems that also benefit all of humanity. The UN is a good system, a sort of an attempt at that. So UN employees, and I've spoken twice at UN headquarters, I know people in the UN system, they have to take a sort of loyalty oath to serve the UN itself, not the nation. And that's very important. So we have some secretary generals like Antonio Guterres, who's there now. Although he's Portuguese, he's not doing policies that will help just his country, Portugal. He has to think in a planetary way. How can he help the whole of humanity? This is a very important responsibility. And all the agencies of the UN, things like the World Health Organization, again, they have to think through planetary problems and how to solve them. I think America's decision to pull out of the WHO is just typical of stupidity. And UNESCO, instead of staying and reforming these institutions for the good, their response is just walk out, which is like a childish adolescent response. And also the work the UN is doing on climate change. I mean, I know our next speaker is a planetary scientist and might want to address that. But again, we need to think through solutions systemically for the whole planet to the problems of climate change and global warming and so on. And the UN has sponsored a lot of work in that. I also think, as I've said before, that academics and thinkers should work for, you know, in each of our fields, we should be working for absolute truth, discovering the facts of our particular subject, irrespective of our nationalist interests or biases. And you know, this is important. So academics, I think, should have freedom of tenure and a duty and responsibility to speak out on things like global issues and so on, and not be fired by their local government. So this is, Kant spoke about the importance of having an independent philosophy faculty in every university. We need to safeguard what's called academic freedom. And that should be part of, you know, where else are the civil servants going to be trained? They're trained at Oxford or Cambridge University. But if the academics are afraid to tell the truth, they're going to end up with you know, people that can't think straight, like we've got now in Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings. They were trained at Oxford, where I used to teach, but I'm ashamed that we've turned out people like this. And it's because of the way that academia itself is being strangled by the corporate interests, and the funding of academia has been corporatized. So there are problems there. And last point, really, I want to just say that it's not just academics that have a duty to find truth, it's intellectuals in general. So every kind of intellectual, a scientist, an academic, you know, whatever branch of knowledge you're working at, we're all interconnected. And this is why I've set up the European branch of the World Intellectual Forum. We're trying to bring intellectuals together. Some may be artists or poets or musicians, but they're thinking through the global significance of their work in the creative industries as well as in the sciences. And I think scientists, one of the things we're calling for in the World Intellectual Forum is scientists should have to swear an oath, like the Hippocratic Oath, not to harm through their scientific work other human beings. So not to work on militarization, weapons of mass destruction. You know, there's the horrible possibility that the people working in bioweapons might have leaked this COVID thing by mistake. Some scientist somewhere in some lab is pulling their hair out thinking, oh my God, I created this, you know. It's possible. And so I'm saying to prevent this ever happening again, they have to swear an oath not to. And they don't get their doctorate unless they swear that. You know, I had a friend who was a professor at University College who knew a man called Verschuer, who was the academic director of Mengele, who was a medical doctor, who went to Auschwitz and experimented on Jewish people. And he tortured them to death and recorded how long it took to die in freezing or hot or whatever. And he called that science. Now, you know, my colleague, Professor Cedric Smith, who was a peace activist and a scientist, said, Thomas, we have to prevent this ever happening again. Scientists have to swear an oath not to do this kind of thing. And that's why my institute and World Intellectual Forum are campaigning for this, like a global scientific oath of integrity and non-harming, ahimsa. Okay, I think that's enough from me. I've said, you know, enough, and I'll hand back to my colleague for comments and things. Thank you so much.
Okay, very insightful presentation, and you have covered almost all the big countries altogether in aspect of civil services. Now I would like to request Siddharth sir to explain something about services system in Mysore and for further discussion. So
thank you, Ranju. Thank you so much. I'd be more keen to talk to Dr. Daffern on some of the concepts that he has talked about, rather than go on to talk about the Indian civil services. Now, having been a mentor to a good number of civil servants in India, there have been some type of psyches that I have observed, that means some type of a behavioral aspect that I have observed. Now, in India, the civil servants are a relic of the British Raj, and they function in the same manner, with the same intent, with the same philosophy, with the same ethos, and with the same ethics as if India was still under a British sovereignty. That has been one. That is after their training is over and then they go on to get posted in the field. The second is the training itself goes on to be completely anglicized. Not exactly, that is, there is hardly any iota of what Indianness can go on to be as a part of it. Now, that is in the sense, that is in sense of culture, in the sense of communication, in the sense of their delegation of duties, in the sense of their lifestyle, in the sense of thinking, in almost everything of sorts. The third is when good number of people go on to look for civil services as a career, then they are those people who think that they can go on to have all the power in their hand without any accountability. Now, Professor Daffern may have known about the accident that took place in Kozhikode yesterday. Can you imagine? It was simply callousness of the bureaucracy of that place. It's not an accident. It's a murder by bureaucracy. It's a clean, cold-blooded murder by the bureaucracy because of the amount of callousness that you're going to see that took place in that region, in the whole of Kozhikode, Calicut region of sorts. And that's not only one example. If you want to pick up example, Indian bureaucrats were the one who handed over the whole of Sri Lanka to China. Indian bureaucrats happened to be, they were the one who had been responsible for a good amount of a tragedy that took place in Bhopal gas tragedy. And if you can go to pick up one event after another, we're going to be having galore of events all in all, which have been there. Now, a good number of students go on to see this. That is, you can go to make umpteenth mistake and still you can go on to get scot-free. And you can go on to get scot-free because of a simple reason that you have a very good cohesion at the civil services level, particularly at the highest level. It may not be so much at the police services level, but at the highest level, there is a very good cohesion to such an extent that they actually go on to become a very powerful, very potent force who can go to stall any government, who can go to run any government in the manner that they go to wish to run. Now, to an extent, the Prime Minister Modi ultimately said that is his first 5 year term has been completely spoiled by the civil servants. Now, after relinquishing his office, President Pranab Mukherjee also said, echoed out the same thing with respect to civil services. He said, he was very categorical in the sense that is, it is the civil services which have been responsible for holding the progress of the country. It is the civil services who pretend to work. We may not go on to pretend to work, to pay them, but then they're going to pretend to work. And right now, as you can go to pick up the civil servants, you will going to find that is most of them go on to think about getting popular on the social media rather than on work. Most of the thinking investment of thinking, which is the prime focus of the civil services, which should be on running an administration, invested their thinking into administration, they go to think of how exactly they can go on to glamorize their services. How is it that they can go on to take a leverage out of the services? How is it that they can go to substitute this power that they have for something else? Anything you can go on to guess on that count. Now, this goes on to become a major attractive force. And coupled with the fact that you are protected in India by Article 311, 312, which makes it very, very difficult to dismiss a civil servant in the country. That makes it doubly difficult. Now, my question to Professor Daffern will be that, what if civil services are taking the country to a crash, rather than the politician who happened to be taking the country towards a crash? You cited an example, that is most of these people in the country are like pilots. They seem to be taking the country towards a crash. And what if the people who you're going to rely on, these are the people who are entrusted with the task of maintaining the continuity of the administration, they are allowing your plane to take to a crash? Professor Daffern.
Well, thank you for that question, and thank you for your comments. They're very insightful. Yes, it's an interesting question. I think the answer has to be strategic. Now, you're an expert in strategic thinking and knowledge management. This is a problem for how we manage this crisis. If I was asked as a consultant to solve this problem, let's say Modi rang me up and said, come and do this, I would look at the code of ethics that civil servants have to sign. And if they don't have one, I would insist, I would bring one in. They can't stay in their job without signing this code of ethics. And the code of ethics would be about working for the benefit of the whole country, for all the people of India. And I would also have, and as I've said, a clause about working for the benefit of the planet as a whole. So global responsibility clause. Now, I would make it very plain to these civil servants that if they're doing what you say, which is pretending to work, I mean, that's a shocking but very insightful phrase, right? Bureaucrats pretending to work, not actually working. And they're working just for their own self-advancement, i.e. egotism. Well, philosophy knows that ego is the cause of all human suffering. It took Buddha to point this out many years ago. He was a great psychologist. And so these civil servants are letting India down, because India is a beacon of light on the planet. You're one of the great spiritual and philosophical nations, the civil servants have a duty, in my opinion, to uphold the law of universality. And I don't know if Modi's intelligent enough to see that the way to solve this problem is not to attack them individually, this or that civil servant, but to change their training, their education, and to bring in a sort of universal ethics. Now, I mean, he's accused of being too Hindu, but the response to that is to say, look, Hinduism itself is a universal religion. The universal ethics that we want is there in Hinduism, actually, at its best. It's in the Upanishads. I'm doing a commentary on the Upanishads. So you can draw that ethic from the Sanatana Dharma, the ancient wisdom of India. And it should be big enough to include the universal ethics of Islam, of Jainism, of Buddhism, because there it's younger children. Hinduism is the oldest religion on the planet, apart from ancient European religions and so on. But these other religions are pretty recent. Buddhism, it's just, it was an offshoot of Hinduism. And its universalism is also there. So I would increase the philosophical training of these civil servants. I'd send them to school for 2 weeks every year to be studying and training in philosophy and ethics in that universal sense. They would come out taking a pledge to work for the universal well-being of all of India. And then these kind of accidents wouldn't happen. It's just they haven't switched on their responsibility brain or their universal compassionate heart. And that is what I think will reform the Indian civil service. And Modi would be wise to actualize that educational program. That's my response to you, sir.
Thank you so much, Dr. Daffern. Now, 2 questions here. The first is, as we understand it, morality and ethics is all what we feel. It's not to be judged. That's one part. So you understand it, that is, what is morality, what is ethics, and what your consciousness goes on to say to it. It's not guided by the law, it's not guided by the protocol, it's not guided by any type of a legislation in this case. You know what is right for the country, what is right for the people, despite the fact that may be several laws in this case. Now, the question is, there are 2 questions intermixed in this case. Can philosophy really train ethics? That's one. And is it that civil servants required to be following the protocol of the law or following the constitution and not following ethics? Because if they can be sometimes antithetical as well. They can be sometimes contradictory as well. Because some of those things may go on to harm the society if they happen to follow that. Because some of these laws are going to become anachronistic. Some of them are not going to fit that situation as well. And some of these type of laws may actually go on to harm the people because they do not want to take the feel of the people into account. That means it's like you have built a bridge in a place for the purpose of taking care of the people. But by the time the circumstances change, the society changed, the economy changed, the site changed, and ultimately the river changes course. The bridge is standing where it is, but then there is no river at all in that case. How do you respond to it, Dr. Daffern?
An interesting set of questions. Let me take them in order. The first point I would want to make is that ethics actually is a science. I think you were sort of implying that it's just subjective, it's just to do with our feelings and so on. And therefore it can't be taken into account when you're dealing with policy and law. I beg to differ, you see, because ethics is a very, very important branch of philosophy. And it's been systematically studied, scientifically studied, since at least Aristotle's time. Aristotle was 300 BC, and he tried to introduce a scientific element into ethics, just as he did into other fields like logic and zoology and all the rest of it. And he argued that the purpose of ethics is to advance the happiness of the aggregate of the society. And any situation you're confronted with, any choice you have to make as a civil servant or a politician or a human being, a father, a mother, you can actually work out systematically which is going to be the most ethical choice. I have to confess, I'm actually writing a book about ethics at the moment, where I'm going to give a tool, some simple tools based on Aristotle and Stoicism and all the different religious approaches, but in a way that people can use in an emergency, like, you know, one afternoon your daughter comes home and tells you something, blah, blah, blah. What should you do? Well, you can use my manual to make a choice within about half an hour. I'm showing a mathematical procedure whereby you can calculate the risks, the benefits, and the happiness outcomes for each choice. So that's a continuation of this scientific approach to ethics. The question of how you juggle these complicated things, and whether laws might be pernicious to the people. Yes, I think that's true. Now, I think, therefore, it's very important that parliaments should institute an officer called the Future Generations Responsibility Officer. Now, I know this has been done in Israel because I know the man. He's a judge called Shlomo Soham. He's on the board of the World Intellectual Forum. He was employed by the Knesset, the parliament in Israel, for a period of about 7 years or so. He had to look at every piece of legislation passed by the parliament from the perspective of the distant future. 7 generations from now, would the people of Israel thank the parliament for passing this law? He had to look at it from a long-term perspective. And if not, he had the duty to send it back to parliament with comments written on it saying, no, don't build the bridge like that. Build the bridge out of ships, and then you can move as the river changes course. You can change the bridge, and then in 7 generations time there'll still be a bridge. It just won't be where you thought. Things like that. And I think that's very important. And he's called the Ombudsman for the future. Now, if you had one in the Indian Parliament, which I strongly recommend, they would look at every law being passed by these politicians and say, how will this look like 700 years from now? Is this a good thing for India or not? And this would get rid of laws that lead to pollution, that lead to corruption, that lead to the destruction of the well-being and happiness of the people. So I think it's very important, that person would be like an ethics ombudsman. And if you have the duty of veracity for politicians, if you give them a license to practice as politicians, and if they lie, they lose their license, this would transform this problem. I think it's time for philosophers and ethical thinkers to fight back against the corruption.
It's very interesting to listen to you and your beautiful answers. So I would like to have one question, I was wondering to ask you, how does the ethics come into play when the civil servants are trained in an alien manner or in an alien environment? Like, I'm asking an aspect of, like, our country, India is now an independent country since more than 70 years, but still we have a great influence of, colonial kind of mindset in the bureaucrats. So how it may, be good or bad being the civil servants in the country right now? Professor Daffern.
That's an important question. I think you need to reflect on the good and the bad that is part of this legacy. The British civil service traditions, which we gave and bequeathed to you, were not all bad. I don't think that it's it helps anyone to sort of institute a witch hunt against all the traditions that the British bequeathed. What you should do is look at them critically and be able to assess, no, this was a good idea, this was a good practice, we'll keep that. But this wasn't because of blah, 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 like the British had a sort of racist attitude. They were very elitist. They had an arrogance about the way they treated Indians. And Gandhi was right to call them out on this and to oppose them. And so I think it's important to use critical thinking. I come back again to philosophy. Critical thinking, so you don't either reject everything or accept everything. you subject it to critical review. And your civil servants in India now, if they were trained more in what I'm proposing, more trained in ethics and the philosophy of Indian culture. I mean, I'm a great fan of the Mughal Empire, I have to confess. I've been to Agra, to all the places where they were working. The Mughals, I mean, I like Akbar in particular. These were geniuses who also wanted the best for India. And some of the details of what they did in their civil service was amazing. Like Akbar insisted on equality between Hindus and Muslims and all that, and Jains. And then if you go back even further to the Mauryan Empire and to Ashoka, again, you find great exemplars of probity and ethics in India that are better than anything that was going on in Europe at the time. So I think in the training of Indian civil servants, they should look at not just the British, but the whole of Indian history. Go right back into the time of, read the scriptures of Manu and what is it to be just and a wise king? It's all there in the epics of Rama and so on. So I think the Indian culture has enough ethics inbuilt into its own philosophical heritage to produce, exemplary civil servants who are faithful to the best bit of the British, reject the worst bit, the arrogance, the racism, the stupidity, but then are faithful to the aggregate sum of all Indian civilization. And you could be tutors to the world in this, in my opinion.
Yeah, very good answer, sir. Siddhartha, sir?
Professor Daffern talked about lateral thinking, critical thinking. I'm more concerned about two aspects about civil services. That is, civil servants elsewhere, and India in particularly, they are not exactly they're not exactly trained for what we're going to be calling it as critical thinking and lateral thinking as well. So even if it is that there is a solution nearby, they completely skip that solution. They are completely unmindful of the fact that a solution can go to be so simple as well. And most of the civil servants, as part of the training, they go on to falling into contrary to what they should be doing in a prescriptive approach. Prescriptive approach, that means should happen. They should be like that. Now, any prescriptive approach solution can go on to completely be open-ended in the sense that it will not going to be any solution at all. How do you think that is how does it go to match with your ethics when you know that can be a solution nearby, but because you have a mental block of sorts, you are not able to look at that solution, and in that process, you go on to do some irreparable damage to the entire of the economy, entire of the country, entire of the nation. Because there are two things which go on to run a country right now. One of them is the idea whose time has come, and that is the launch of that idea, the timing of that idea. And the second is the speed with which the idea can be implemented. And the third is the simplicity of this idea itself. That is, to what extent it can be simplified. That is the role of a facilitator, which the civil services has to be. They're going to assume the role of king in this place, ignoring lateral thinking, ignoring a lot of simple solutions, local wisdom as well. They're going to make it more and more centralized. How exactly ethical it is and how to deal with this ethical dilemma.
Problems, and they're not just in India, they're in every country. We know the problem of bureaucracy is it thinks in walls instead of bridges. So if I'm in the department of X and a problem comes up that is sort of between X and Y, I'll send it over to Y. I will try and not deal with it, because the standard modality of being for the bureaucrat is inertia. The bureaucrat doesn't want to do anything. If they can say no to something and we'll do it another time or take it away, that's their response, right? So inertia, which is in Hindu terms, it's raja. It's the kind of it's just it's a non-doing. You know? That's the worst one. That's the black one that does nothing at all. So I think the solution is in getting the walls to come down. Civil servants should be servants of the whole. And even though you're in a department, say transport or food and agriculture or culture and heritage, you know, the government is so complex. You have such a vast country. You have to have departments and ministries and so on. But wherever you're placed, you should think of yourself as a servant of the whole and look at whatever problem is in front of you. Let's say the museum in Jaipur is falling down and, you know, the roof needs fixing and there's no money, and how do you solve it, right? And you're in the Ministry of Heritage and Museums. Well, you should think holistically, and you should ring up the Department of Transport and say, look, you've got workers that can fix roofs. They're not working at the moment. They're supposed to be on the railways, but can you lend me 100 people that can like fix my roof, you know? And that should be okay. One solution is to get, when they're training these civil servants, to go and spend time with 3 or 4 different ministries. So you don't get embedded in the one place. You don't become just a Ministry of Transport guy. You see the whole of governance and you move about. That will encourage lateral thinking. The other thing is the response of no should be changed by the response of yes. We have to get people thinking positively and finding a way to yes. You know, how can I solve this problem? Not, oh, it's too difficult or it's too visionary. You know, utopian thinking is the yes response to life. There are so many problems that need transforming in society, but as long as we all go on thinking, no, it can't be done, it won't be done. So we have to get people to think positively. And if they think strategically and ethically and holistically, so you look from the perspective of the whole, which is after all what Brahma is supposed to be, right? The creator, Brahma or Allah, whatever you want to call him, is the whole, concerned about the whole of society, not just this or that bit. So each of us should be like a secret agent for Brahma, you know, working to bring the whole into harmony. And even though you may be just working for the post office or the railways, you can be Brahma's secret agent on the job. And that's about ethical training and also about philosophy. You have to know your, you know, your text, your heritage to be able to say that. I hope that helps.
Very good, sir. I do agree that your recommendation, especially towards the ethical intelligence and the code of ethics, you know, these 2 things should be unanimously everywhere given to all the civil servants. And that will be good for the progress of that country. And I have another question, you know, Mumbai is the Bollywood city in India. It's very famous. And there's some controversies keep coming. And nowadays there's a issue of Sushant Singh Rajput's death issue. So I have a question that Bollywood since long is having a lot of stories and reports having some anti-national activities, patriotic activities happening from within the Bollywood inside. Like people are living in India, but they are behaving in anti-nationalistic activities. So in your opinion, like how to control such kind of dilemma by a civil servants, like how we can deal with this situation when such kind of activities are happening inside the country, which is, you know, against the integrity and sovereignty of the country. Professor Daffern.
I'm not familiar with the you know, the details of Mumbai. I've not been to Mumbai. It's one of the few big cities in India I've not been to yet. But I have known people from Mumbai quite well. I know the Jain community, and you know, I've met many people. I know a chap who runs a school, a public school in Mumbai, who's British. I think it must be a communication problem. I'm a great believer in communication as the solution to problems. And if we look at this from the perspective of being Brahma's secret agents, as I was saying earlier, I think this split between internationalism and, Indian nationalism is a false duality. It's a false argument. As I said before, within Indian philosophy and cultural and intellectual heritage, you are potentially the most internationalist country on the earth. More religions have come out of India, including Sikhism and Hinduism and Buddhism and Jainism and Sufism, than any other country in the world. You've produced universalism. And so, I mean, if I come to India and say, look, I'm an internationalist, I despise your little Hindu culture, and I don't know anything about India, it's like I'm proving my own ignorance. So I don't know who in Bollywood is saying that. They must be very stupid. And likewise, I would say if any Indian or Hindu or whatever says, we hate internationalists, they're being rude about India. Well, we need to bring these two sides together into a common discourse. And I think it's possible. So, yeah, this tension can be mediated through communication, I would say.
So that's okay. We had a wonderful discourse on that part. A brilliant insights, some of these were, and I happened to learn a good number of things from Professor Daffern. I'm going to thank him for that purpose, right? It's up to you, Arunji, now.
Okay. I was just asking that whether adopting a tact of honesty is more dangerous to a civil servant than actually bearing the honesty. Like how he has to discriminate between the honesty part, how a civil servant has to play the part and has to keep foot on the two boards together.
I think, thank you for raising the question, but I don't believe truth is a threat to anything apart from unjust power. Truth is satya, right? It's the weapon of all people of righteousness. It's the weapon of Gandhi and of all the great teachers of humanity, truth. And it's only a threat to forces of evil and darkness and ignorance. You see, ignorance, which is the cause of human suffering, always works with lies. And lies can be not deliberate, open lies. They can be distortions. They can be semi-truths which masquerade as complete truths. Okay, so we need to, as intellectuals, as philosophers, and we need to be on our guard against semi-truths masquerading as the whole truth. And this is why I think civil servants, all of them, should be trained at the highest possible level in lateral thinking, intellectual activity, to be able to discern truth and lies. We have to be able to tell the difference. To be a Jain monk or a Buddhist monk, you have to train to do this. To be a Hindu rishi, you study. Well, I think the same standards should apply in the civil service. And to be a philosopher of any kind, you have to know the difference between falsity and truth. One of the problems we have in the world is this idea of moral relativism. Your truth can be your truth, mine is mine, that's fine. There is no absolute truth. There's no right or wrong. There's just what you feel like. No, I think there are moral absolutes. Killing people is wrong, period, end of story. Torturing people is wrong. And stealing is wrong, So we need to be really clear about the force of truth, and it brings with it responsibility. So I don't think it's ever a threat. And I'm not saying it's just, you called it a tactic. You said truth is a tactic. No, it's not a tactic. It's a legal duty. What I'm proposing is truth becomes a legal duty on politicians and civil servants, not a tactic. And the only people that would be afraid, so people I discuss this with in Britain say, my God, Thomas, this is radical. There'd be no politicians left if they had to tell the truth. So my response is to say, no, well, the current lot would all go, the evil ones, but a whole bunch of new righteous ones would come in. youngsters, young people that understand the difference between truth and lies. They're the people we need running the world. People 30 years old who haven't learned how to be corrupt yet, you know, haven't learned that you get on in life if you lie and cheat and are unethical. No, we need people that are prepared to take a truth oath. And in Congress in America, there are like the young woman Cortez, this amazing American woman, Spanish descent, who is standing up and telling these old Republican congressmen that they're rude to her. You know, one of them was swearing at her on the outside of Congress, telling her rude things. She had the courage to get up and say, this is not acceptable. We need people like her in all the Congress and parliaments around the world. It's coming, but it's going to be a long fight. And, you know, our job is just to do it non-violently, as Gandhi said, gently, insisting people tell the truth. I mean, is that too much to ask? You know.
Thank you. My last question, as you explained that in UK, there's no written constitution. Unlike India, we have a written constitution. Why it is so? What are the pros and cons? Why? What are the advantages and disadvantages to have a written constitution or not to a country in today's world?
Yes, I mean, I've thought about this a lot as a philosopher. I used to think the British system was quite good. It was based on a sort of tacit oral culture and agreement. Sort of, we used to call it my word is my bond, a gentleman's code, you know, et cetera, sense of honor. The trouble is the UK, that's broken down now because it only works if people have a sense of honor and ethics. What we've now got is a whole bunch of politicians that haven't got a clue about the difference between right and wrong and truth and lies, who have seized control of power like totally ruthlessly. And I've now come round to the view, along with many others, that we do need a written constitution as a safeguard against that. So I think every country should have a written constitution. Most of them do. Interestingly, Israel doesn't. I think Israel also should have a written constitution, which guarantees the rights of the Palestinians, minorities. One of the reasons Israel is allowed to get away with persecuting the Palestinians and not having a peace agreement with them is because they don't have a written constitution, and they've inherited that from the British. So this is naughty. It's naughty because, you know, if there's nothing in writing, you can just get away with it. So no, we need a written constitution. That's one of the things the French did, and it's probably because I've come to live in France, I've accepted their wisdom in having a written constitution. And I have a copy of my French constitution just over there.
Oh, that's so great.
Yeah, so vive la République, as Macron would say.
We had a very wonderful discussion together. I'm thankful to you, Professor Daffern, joining from Paris, and Sri Siddhartha from Delhi. And we enjoyed a lot. It was so insightful. And thank you so much from bottom of my heart to both of you.
Thank you, Professor Daffern. Thank you so much.
Thank you.